Thank you, Kim. And first of all, a great thanks to the ICA for putting on this trade event and for giving this important subject pride of place to open the ICA trade event. We have a full subject matter today, very important. Bill Kingdon talked about the importance of promoting cotton as a textile of choice. Well, we really need to do it because we're losing today and we continue to lose. And as I hope you will see from this panel, if we don't pull together and do something about this, it won't be long before cotton is a marginal commodity and everyone is wearing polyester. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce the panel very briefly and then we'll turn to the subject matter. Thank you. On my left is Eva Bille, who is EU Policy Director at Hill & Knowlton, which is a policy consultancy in Brussels. Welcome, Eva. Then there is Elisabeth van Delden, who is Campaign Manager for Make the Label Count, and you'll be hearing about Make the Label Count a lot today. She's also the Sustainability Manager for Woolmark, so a natural fiber ally. And on the far left is Eric Trachtenberg, who is Executive Director of ICAC, and as you will see today, ICAC has been extremely vocal in supporting Make the Label Count and in promoting cotton globally. So I'm going to start, before we get into the subject matter of the experts on my left, with a scary picture, which is the picture of cotton as a blend globally in textiles. And it's not pretty. If legislation continues down the path it's on right now, then it's only going to accelerate and it's only going to get worse. But we'll come on to more of that later. I'd like to hand over to Eva to talk to us a little bit about the legislative framework, where it exists and why it's so important. Eva.
Thank you. I think it's no surprise that EU policy has been important to cotton for many years, but the veritable avalanche of legislation that has come out of the Green Deal has increased in both volume and importance, I think, for the industry. I have, for the sake of simplicity, there's obviously a lot more and there's a lot going on, but for sake of simplicity, I have categorized these legislations into 5 different groupings. There is things that impact how products are financed, that are investor-related legislations. There are supply chain legislations. There are legislations about making and disposing of a product. There are legislation, of course, about reporting. And then finally, once all of the legislative requirements are met, legislations about what kind of information do you need to make claims and to substantiate those claims credibly. Underpinning all of this, of course, is all the global work the EU is doing. There's the Paris Agreement. There's a commitment to be net zero by 2050. There are efforts towards a global plastics treaty. There are many other things happening around the EU. But the reason why I wanted to start with the EU here is because this is really where a lot of the EU typically goes further and goes first. So if the EU gets the methodologies in these legislations wrong, then it is likely to travel both for companies that are active in the EU and wider around the world. Now, briefly covering the pieces of legislation on here, on financing, we have the taxonomy that classifies what is considered a sustainable investment, and of course, accompanying that, disclosures, regulations, so that investors actually have to disclose what they invest in. On supply chain, I think this is a really important piece. Of course, the widest ranging piece of supply chain legislation is the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, or CSDDD as it is affectionately called. And this piece of legislation really mandates all large companies operating in the EU to know what's going on in their supply chain and to have compliance mitigation in place and to actually have complaint mechanisms in place and to understand really more fully what's going on in the supply chain. And this is something that impacts all large companies, no matter what they produce. And of course, there's the forced labor regulation, which is a much simpler piece of legislation, but really makes it possible for the EU to destroy or confiscate a piece of an item that has entered the EU market if evidence is found that it has been made using forced labor. And of course, deforestation. This is not a legislation where cotton is in scope, but it is the most wide-ranging due diligence legislation coming out of the EU because it mandates a geolocation, it mandates other information requirements evidencing that the commodities that are in scope are deforestation-free since 2020. And cotton, of course, is on the list of things that could be in scope in the future. It's not imminent because the legislation was just delayed by 1 year, but it's still something to be aware of and to follow as well. And with this, I think in supply chain legislation, the focus on transparency and on traceability is going to increase for all companies that operate in the textile space. Moving on to the making and disposing of a product group, that's quite wide, but the very important piece of legislation there is the Eco-Design for Sustainable Products Regulation. And this is a regulation that defines or sets parameters for what is considered sustainable by design. And so far, there's an umbrella legislation in place. It talks about durability of products. It talks about recyclability, recycled content, but also about environmental footprints. And there will be, in the recent future, a textile delegated act that defines what this means for textiles. And in this piece of legislation, which is also the legislation you will have heard of that mandates digital product passports, in this legislation, it's going to be incredibly important what type of methodology is used to define sustainable by design, to define environmental footprint. And that's something that I know Elisabeth will cover a lot in her section, but I just want to point out that this is one of the key pieces of legislation where if the methodology promotes the wrong type of fiber or the what is actually in reality not the most sustainable fiber, then both the EU would be acting against its own goals, but there's also a huge risk of repercussions because this is about all products designed and put on the EU market and not just about claims. In other pieces of legislation in that category include public procurement guidelines, where the EU, it's a guideline, it's not law, but the EU's recommendations carry weight, and they do have recommendations on what fibers are considered sustainable for public procurement. So that would be when municipalities order bed sheets for old people's homes and these types of public procurement. And the Waste Framework Directive, very briefly, this is the one that covers the EPR scheme in the EU, so the extended producer responsibility. And there is a mandatory textile collection target in place, so all EU countries need to collect textiles by 2025. So that will mean that there will be a lot more textile collection in the EU and also a lot more focus on textile waste, which could be a good thing if cotton is classified as biodegradable and therefore not as waste in the same way that plastics fibers would be. But it could also be, it's all in the implementation phase at member state level right now, so there's still some question marks there. On reporting, it's a really important category because, of course, we need to have a baseline of measuring what companies are doing before we can know whether or not they're improving. So this is also one of the first pieces of legislation to be adopted, and it's one of the ones that is the furthest along in the implementation as well, and the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which really has also in the detail level on reporting on environmental, social, and governance aspects, and that includes everything from biodiversity to, of course, climate change, to workers in the value chain, to communities. So there's a lot of different aspects that already need to be measured under the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. And there will be also textiles guidance in the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive that will be released soon. And that's another place where obviously the methodology of the textile guidance is going to be really important, because we have to make sure that companies are asked to measure the right things when they do their corporate sustainability reporting. Finally, of course, making claims. I think this is one of the most talked about pieces of legislation, which is, first of all, the Empowering Consumers for the Green Transition Directive, which is the baseline. It says Don't make vague claims. Don't make claims based on offsets if you're not saying what you're offsetting. So it's quite a sort of foundational baseline, not just in green claims, but in claims in general. But on top of that, there will be the Green Claims Directive, which is currently in the final stages of negotiation. And this is the piece of legislation that will, in detail, specify the scientific evidence that's needed to make claims, and will specify the types of what data you need to make an impact claim, what type of data you need to make a performance claim. And this is going to be very important that they get it right in these final negotiation stages and don't point companies in the wrong direction, so that they make environmental claims based on data that does not, in fact, lead to the best outcomes. Textile labeling as well and EU eco-label are other pieces of legislation, but I think if you remember just two out of this slide, I would really ask that you think of the Green Claims Directive, because that's going to set the baseline for all claims, and the Eco-Design for Sustainable Products Regulation, because that sets the parameters for digital product passport, and that defines what is considered sustainable in product design. Now, that's a lot, of course. These are not all coming at the same time. This little timeline shows, in very simplified terms, where these laws are, and of course some of them, like taxonomy for sustainable investment, that's already in place. But the Green Claims Directive, as I mentioned, is one that is still being negotiated. And finally, the textile labeling regulation, there is one in place, but it has not yet. There's a revision coming, it has been announced, but we don't know anything about what's going to be in that revision yet. So the different laws are in different stages of completion. And I'll end with this slide on a little bit on the direction of travel. This is not a complete map, but it shows some of the legislations how some of these legislations are traveling around the world. And as you can see by the red color on the map, reporting is one of those types of legislation that has traveled the furthest already, because it is, as I said, the baseline. If you need to measure where you are before you can know how to improve. So that's what a lot of countries around the world have adopted as well. But due diligence and supply chain legislations, forced labor, those types of legislations are also increasingly happening, both in Canada and Australia, around the world. And I think we will see more product design and claims. There are, of course, claims legislation in the US as well, the green guides, but I think we will see a lot more of the product design and the claims legislation traveling around the world as well in the future. So important to keep an eye on.
Thank you, Eva. I mean, it's absolutely bamboozling to those of us not involved in this every day, the landscape we are going to have to navigate when it comes to legislation. You can understand now how hard it is to go from sitting in this room and talking about it to actually getting up and doing something about it, because it's so confusing, that legislative framework and the landscape around EU legislation. And believe you me, many of the people involved in promoting polyester have figured it out. So we need to now figure this out. Turning to Elisabeth. Specific to cotton and the EU, how is the EU planning to measure cotton's impact? And where does Make the Label Count fit in?
Yeah, thank you. So Eva really set the ground for me, so thank you for that. And yeah, especially those legislative pieces that Eva mentioned, the eco-design regulation and green claims. Across these two legislations is the challenge, what you just said, Bill, of how to measure and how to prove that a product, or let's say a cotton t-shirt, is sustainable or not. And that's where we come to the product environmental footprint, also known as PEF. And PEF basically measures from the whole supply chain along the whole life cycle of a product, from farm to the garment to end of life, how sustainable that product is or not. And the basis for that is life cycle assessment. And PEF is actually, it's not a legislation, so that needs to be very clear, but it is a methodology or a tool that is then referenced in legislation to be used or to be recommended to use, maybe even mandatory to be used. And PEF is also a very broad framework that originally was designed, I think, for home appliances. So if we have washing machines or refrigerator, there it actually worked quite well. But there are a lot of challenges when you apply PEF to textiles. So let's have a look what these challenges are. I'll give you 3 examples. There are more, but let's keep it to 3 for today. So the product environmental footprint looks at 16 environmental impact categories. And these range from global warming potential, land use, water use, resource depletion, etc. But what the problem is here is that these 16 impact categories don't account for impacts that measure the sustainability of synthetic fibers. So we don't have an impact category to measure microplastic pollution, and we don't have an impact category to measure plastic waste. So all the garments then end up in a landfill or even in the ocean. And we also don't have an impact category that properly measures circularity, so biodegradability, being able to give products a second life. So if we have a system that is blind to these environmental impacts of synthetics, it actually skews the result in favor of synthetics and is biased against natural fibers. And the second example is what we call the system boundary issue. So I said PEF is based on the methodology of life cycle assessment, and in life cycle assessment you need to set a system boundary because the supply chain is extremely long and complex, and in order to measure it you need to set some boundaries. What do you count into the assessment of this product and what do you leave out? And there's an ISO standard for life cycle assessment that actually says you shouldn't be comparing apples and pears. You should only be comparing apples with apples. So apply that to textiles. You shouldn't actually be comparing a product made of natural fibers or with synthetics. Or in even broader terms, you shouldn't be comparing an agriculturally farmed product like cotton with a mined raw oil-based product like synthetics or polyester. But in PEF, we actually are comparing synthetics with natural fibers. And that's now where the system boundary issue is, because for natural fibers, the system boundary has been set to include all the resources that go into the farm. So the land, the water use. I come from the wool industry, so we're also counting the digestive systems of sheep, the burping and other things that sheep emit. So all of those are accounted for, but for synthetics, we're basically starting with the free raw material. So the oil bubbling out of the ground is free to use for humans, and that's an understandable argument, but it's not a level playing field for natural fibers. So natural fibers already come to the game of being compared with a much bigger environmental footprint than synthetics, and we believe this is not a fair system and it shouldn't be done. And there are solutions to that, but for now, let's just stick with this issue. It's more complex then. And another issue that we find with PEF is when you looked at those 16 environmental impacts, they were all about environmental harm. So we're not accounting for any of the environmental good that natural fibers such as cotton bring. The ecosystem services that you as a cotton industry have, such as renewability, biodegradability, sequestering carbon into the soil, when we go to regenerative agriculture, improving biodiversity, all of those positive impacts are not at all taken into consideration. And this, again, favors synthetic fibers and is biased against natural fibers. And this is not even taken into account the socioeconomic benefits that natural fibers bring to a lot of the livelihoods in rural communities around the world. So many communities depend on commodities like cotton, but they're not just a commodity, they are a very important resource of income. to rural communities. So this sounds all very theoretical, but so that's why Bill asked me to also make it a little bit more practical. So I invented this, so this is not what currently is being discussed. So for now, we do not know how PEF will actually be communicated towards the consumer. We only know that from home appliances, for example, and you might recognize this kind of label, is that if you could apply PEF to communicate in kind of a traffic light system, that, and if you use PEF for textiles, it would result in a polyester t-shirt getting maybe kind of a green traffic light rating, while a cotton t-shirt would get a lower environmental score. So this will be quite confusing for consumers, we think. Like, they won't understand why a natural fiber product is bad for the environment while a synthetic one is not. But it also has an effect on sourcing. So already today we know that brands work with tools like PEF. And they have their own goals of reducing climate impacts, reducing certain emissions. So they're using this to calculate the sustainability of the products they design, and they also want to put on the market products that have a positive environmental claim. So they come to the conclusion of switching to synthetics, reducing natural fibers in their sourcing. And I work for Woolmark. We already have brands coming to us saying, oh, we want to use natural fibers, we want to use wool, but the numbers are just not telling us to use it. So this is a huge threat for that first slide that Bill had of further decline of natural fibers, and including cotton. And perversely, this is actually, as Eva also said, the opposite of what they use trying to achieve. They use trying to achieve a circular, sustainable economy, trying to achieve, they actually said, we want to put fast fashion out of fashion, we want to fight microplastic pollution, but with a tool like this, they're actually achieving more. They're giving a license to sell more synthetics, have more fast fashion produced, which will be more microplastic in our oceans and our countryside. So,
Eva, you said you made this slide up, which honestly is pretty terrifying. But are those numbers, the scores, do they more or less reflect reality? In other words, if a brand was looking to become more sustainable, are those the numbers more or less they would use? And so it creates an almost wholesale switch away from cotton if you want to be a sustainable brand.
Yeah, and I didn't put wool on there. The wool one is off the chart. So, so with this situation, we founded already in 2021, Make the Label Count, and our goals are to raise awareness about PEF, raise awareness about the shortcomings of PEF, and also encourage policymakers not to include PEF, at least not for textiles in EU regulation. So right now we're a proud number of 46 members. We grew quite a lot this year because a lot of you cotton organizations joined us, so that's really great to have your support. And our ask is very simple, to include these 3 additional impact categories in PEF, because that would even the level playing field, and it would give a much more accurate picture of the environmental costs that all fibers have. Of course, then we're not yet even including the social impacts, but that's another story. Maybe next year you'll invite us.
But this is urgent, right? This is happening right now.
Yeah, so right now we're focusing on the Green Claims Directive, where this is referenced, and it's in this last stage of negotiations. So all our efforts right now are on talking to policymakers, educating them about this issue to ensure that PEF is not being written into the law.
Okay, thank you, Elisabeth. So we know there's a problem. Turning to Eric, Elisabeth mentioned that LCAs are being used, but they're a dangerous tool. We also know that a lot of data is needed in order to do a better job of engaging around LCAs and proving that cotton is actually sustainable, which the EU seems to believe is not the case today. How can the ICAC help?
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank ICA and to Bill and to Kim for inviting me here. I'm just going to move a little bit closer to the screen so I can actually see what I'm saying. It's a pleasure to be in Liverpool because my great-grandfather emigrated from here a little over 100 years ago. So it's like a little bit of a homecoming to come back to the home of cotton in the UK. So what I want to do is talk about cotton as a global public good, and I think this is the key we should make. We all have a stake, not just in the industry, but from agriculture to the consumer to the global environment. But first what I want to do is I was asked to introduce ICAC. I was told that not everybody knows who we are. So we are actually the United Nations of Cotton and Products. We were founded in 1939 in Washington, which makes us 6 years older than the UN. We're an intergovernmental commodity body. There are several of these kind of entities. There's one for coffee and cocoa. And we report directly to our member governments, about half of which are actually in Africa. What do? We are probably the world's preeminent source of data and publications on topics related to cotton. We do work in agriculture development. We're very focused on sustainability and traceability. We're moving much more downstream into the textile sector. We have engagement through our Private Sector Advisory Council. We're now looking more at doing promotion, and of course the final topic is policy engagement and support. So what are the opportunities we face? Well, regulation is a response, but these are legitimate concerns about the environmental footprint of textiles. It is a real problem. The key issue is not whether the rules are going to go forward. They will, but what form will they take? Some of these could disadvantage cotton. Some of these could actually turn out not to be bad for cotton. It's up to us. Success will depend on our ability to make the case to governments, consumers, and civil society and the private sector that cotton is a global public good. Everyone on this planet should have a stake in the cotton economy because when you look at issues like greenhouse gases and microplastics, it affects everybody. There are two strong arguments that I'm going to be looking at. One is the environmental argument, the other is the livelihoods question. So stepping back and looking at the environment of textiles, these are the reasons why agencies might want to regulate textiles. First is it is a large share of greenhouse gases. It uses a lot of water. It generates a lot of water pollution. It actually is a channel for added pollution, not only water, but in air. It generates a lot of waste. Recycling is still very small. And so when you look at the big picture, there is really a problem. And denying the problem doesn't do us any good. The question is being sure that the solutions to that problem may actually not only do us harm, but in a really good outcome could actually benefit us in some ways. So stepping back, you hear a lot of stereotypes about cotton, the dreaded 20,000 liters of water for a t-shirt. Again, we have the data. This is based on a 1,000-page publication that we put out every year in an online data set. Cotton does not have an unusually bad environmental footprint. It only occupies 2.5% of global cropland, less than 2% of irrigation water, less than 5% of pesticides by value or volume, only 2.8% of fertilizers. And so when you look at the use of pesticides, in this case by value, it's much less than a lot of these other commodities that somehow don't come under the same kind of criticism that cotton does. Let's look at GHG, greenhouse gases, especially when it's harvested, when it's produced sustainably. Fabrics can sequester carbon. Biochar can sequester carbon. Cover crops can sequester carbon. No-till can reduce carbon emissions. And when you look at greenhouse gases per kilogram of fiber, cotton has one of the lowest emissions. So in terms of the effects on the global environment, it's better. How does this work? There was talk about carbon sequestration. Carbon fibers are 96 to 98% cellulose. It sequesters half a kilo of additional CO2 per kilogram of fiber. Products like cotton fabrics and furniture made from cotton stalks also maintain carbon. The carbon in the clothing can last for 20 years, and biochar can last for 100 years. And one of the things we're thinking about is eventually moving to a payment for ecosystem services so that when farmers actually produce biochar, they can actually get paid for that. This is something that we are developing as I speak. Cotton biodegrades in the soil. In 12 weeks, polyester does not. When you use synthetics, more waste, more BPAs and other forever chemicals, more release of micro and nanoplastics, and this linear consumption model where you do it and you dump it, it's not consistent with the circular economy. As Elisabeth rightly pointed out, these issues should be measured, but they're not. So these pictures basically show how quickly a polyester versus a cotton t-shirt break down in the environment. The top is polyester. You can see after week 12, it's basically the same. Cotton, you put it in the ground, and 12 weeks, it's mostly broken down. But it's not only what it breaks down into counts. When you have a polyester t-shirt, it breaks down eventually, but then it becomes smaller and smaller, microplastics, nanoplastics that get everywhere in the environment. When cotton breaks down, it really biodegrades and it really just goes away. So it's not going to persist in the environment and cause what are now, it's been linked to cardiovascular disease, destruction of the oceans. When cotton breaks down, it doesn't result in these things. Polyester will just get smaller and smaller and smaller, but those particles are out there, in my estimation, poisoning all of us. So I want to take a look at the next argument. One is the livelihoods issue, that in many countries in the world, especially in Africa, cotton is really important. We just celebrated our first ever World Cotton Day in Benin, and it is the largest export commodity in the country. In fact, the president is a cotton farmer. But it's a major product in Burkina Faso, and Mali, and Chad. Of course, also, it's a major product for a lot of our producers, especially the large exporters, Brazil, United States, and Australia. So cotton matters a lot. The reason why I'm focusing on Africa so much is because I do believe there's a high level of interest in the EU on the plight of the African farmer. So I'm not neglecting other countries. I just believe these arguments will be more salient with the people we're trying to talk to. So I'm not going to go through all this because I don't want to put everyone to sleep, but Africa does have real potential. And I'm sure this presentation will be available. There's access to sustainable cotton. There's interest in moving downstream. There are some preferential trade agreements that help them, such as AGOA, the EPAs in the EU. There's a lot going on on this slide, but there is real potential. So what I want to do is kind of go back to the two arguments. Cotton is a global public good because it's nature positive, it's biodegradable, lower greenhouse gases. It's called this xerophite, which means it grows where other crops can't, like around Lubbock, Texas, or in the Sahel are two areas where other crops have a hard time growing. It also can sequester carbon. On the other side, the livelihoods argument, it's a cash crop for farmers. It has potential for downstream and textiles, potential to reduce poverty and conflict, and of course, it's a powerful driver of women's empowerment, as we see the woman in cotton booth outside. And 43% of cotton farmers are women. So these are some of the faces of cotton. I always think of myself as working for the farmers, or to quote Norman Borlaug, you always have to take it to the farmer. Some of the action steps. The first is kind of a controversial bullet, but we're looking at it. Is there a premium that people are willing to pay for cotton? I know a lot of people don't believe it, but it's something we want to look at. My sense is there might be one, but it's not going to be big, maybe 10%. This is actually something we're going to be looking at later this year. We all need to make the public case for cotton to connect to farmers. All these issues matter. And if we can work with farmers, cotton traders, environmental civil society, which we are actually reaching out to, quality brands and governments, then we can make the case that cotton is a global public good. If we engage successfully, then maybe we can convince some people to move the needle, either through factual arguments, but also through sentiments that are driven by these really pressing concerns. So this brings me to my presentation. I look forward to questions and discussion.
Thank you, Eric. We'll come to questions at the end. I'm just going to turn to wrap up with a couple more questions. And Eva, I'm going to turn to you again first, because I want to get a little bit concrete. There's a lot of smart people in this room. Not everybody, but a lot of smart people in this room. I bet half of them still don't really understand how we can get it done. So can you tell me a little bit, just briefly, about who is actually making the decisions at the moment?
Absolutely, and I think there's, for the different legislations, of course, it depends where they are in that slide I showed you on the timeline. But I just wanted to very briefly cover the EU legislative procedure for you, not to put you to sleep as well, but to, to cover the different stages of how legislation is made, because this really matters for the Green Claims Directive, which, as Elisabeth mentioned, I think is the top priority right now, because this is the one that policymakers is looking at right now, and this is where it would really matter to speak to them. So any proposal goes through a first phase, and this is obviously the best place to start, a bit late for green claims, but the first stage is where the European Commission puts it out to public consultation, where they write a proposal between the 30,000 civil servants, mostly in one silo, and not all 30,000 of them, but they together write the proposal, and that stage is the best stage, of course, to influence legislation. Green claims has moved past that. Then it moves into a more political stage where the European Parliament, which is the directly elected representatives of European countries, they discuss it. They have, in the case of green claims, they appointed 2 lead committees, so the Environment Committee and the Consumer Committee. Those were in charge of forming their opinions on it, and then together after there's a rapporteur, there's been amendments to have together the Parliament's position on this topic. In the case of the Parliament, this was an interesting case because they voted on their position in March. And as you may know, the European elections happened in June this year, and neither of the 2 rapporteurs were re-elected. So there was it was in a bit of a limbo of whether or not and how it was going to continue. But it has now been, they have now decided that they will go ahead with the Parliament position that they agreed on in March, so it can move on quite quickly. There are 2 new rapporteurs, Delaria Burkhardt from Germany and Sandro Gossi from France. And these 2 are going to be key in taking this proposal, this Parliament's position forward to the next stage. In parallel as well, the Council, as you see in the bottom line of the little tram line, the Council, which is the national governments of the different member states, they come together as well. The environment ministers meet to discuss the Council position on the Green Claims Directive. And what's happening right now, where we are now, is the first dot where the lines join up again, which is entering trilogue negotiations. And this is a really important step because the Commission will come in and defend its position, the Parliament will come in and defend its position, and the Council will defend its position. So all 3 EU parties will work together on a final text. And of course, there's not oceans of room. We cannot scrap it and start over, but between the 3 positions, there are some that are clearly better than others. And I think the one we're worried about is the Council's position, where they have a much stronger nod to the PEF. But what's good, the good news is that the Parliament text did not as strongly reference the life cycle assessments, neither did the Commission's. So if we can come in strong and talk to the permanent representations, the representatives of the Council in Brussels, and the members of the European Parliament and the Commission, now it's not too late to keep PEF out of green claims.
That's the key question, because it looks like we're nearly at the end, but there is still time to influence?
There's still time to influence because we have a Commission proposal that is better than the Council position.
And Elisabeth, if we are not able to influence, and if this gets enacted in its current myopic, short-sighted, form which favors polyester. Is it limited to the EU, or is there a risk of contagion globally?
Yeah, I'll answer that in a minute, but I'll just add maybe to give you a time frame. So we're expecting negotiations to start in November, and this whole thing will be wrapped up in Q1 of 2025 next year. So we have like a 4 to 5 months, no, 4 to 5 months time frame where and we're already starting. We've already engaged with members of parliaments asking for meetings. We're doing the same with council. We're activating our members in member states. So if we have an Italian member, we're asking them to contact their ministries. If we have a German member, we're asking them to do the same in Germany. So we are already reaching out, and it's basically because we had this vote of the parliament in June that we have 60% of newcomers. So all the work we've done so far between 2021 and now, we have to educate again about these issues because policymakers might not be aware of the issues. So that's why we're really active, and both Eva represents 3 cotton organizations in Brussels, and we've joined forces, so we're also interacting and engaging and informing each other of news. So that's where we're really active right now. So we're here, but we're also very active doing the work. So.
And the work thus far has been largely supported by the wool industry, and it's only recently that the cotton industry has got behind it. Is ICAC supportive of this, Eric? Is this something that you're promoting and involved with?
Oh, very, very much so. Matter of fact, we worked with ICA, with Terry Townsend, with Bremen, and we basically collectively recruited a lot of support. I think we raised over close to $250,000 to support. So we can't sign up because we're an intergovernmental organization, but we work very closely with both Eva and Make the Label Count. And because we're an intergovernmental organization, we report to the EU. But again, our goal is to help the EU achieve its stated environmental objectives, which somehow coincidentally is very good for cotton. But that is our role. We work for member governments. So
yeah, and you touched on the money side of things and the need to finance the efforts that are being made. Elisabeth, I want to come back to you and finish on the campaign.
I didn't answer. But I'll also answer your other question. So, and I think Eva already mentioned that earlier, that EU legislation often gets exported to other countries. So it is very important to get this right because there is a big chance of copy-paste into other countries. We already know France has developed something similar to PEF, but actually they improved it. So we're actually quite happy with what France is doing. They're doing a better job. But we see Canada is looking at green claims or has already made it a law. Other countries are also closely following what's happening in the EU. So it's really important to get this right. Okay, sorry. I answered that. So so obviously, it would be great if more cotton organizations also joined Make the Label Count, because we have a much stronger voice the more organizations we have behind us, and also we can bring much better arguments with all our knowledge combined. Having the facts is key here. And so, it would be great if more organizations can join. Obviously, it's a campaign. It also costs money, so any funding that is available for this will amplify whatever we're doing. We're doing the work, but with more money we can obviously do more communications and get the message out there. If you're not able to join us directly, but please then follow us on LinkedIn, share our LinkedIn posts, also raise awareness. I mean, what we're doing today is also raising awareness, so if you have a conference where you'd like us to speak, we're happy to do that. And I think the more we can get the message out there about PEF, about EU legislations and the consequences for cotton and natural fibers, the better. And also, as I said, we need a lot of facts and expertise and research. So whatever new research that any of you have coming out or good case studies, we're also happy to use that in our work.
Yes, Eric.
I just wanted to make a pitch again for Make the Label Count. I think, I think, You know, and I know some people discuss the cost and things like that. For the level of work they're doing, it's actually reasonable. And when you think of it this way, yeah, it is a few $100,000s a year, but it's a multi-billion-dollar market, and there's no guarantee of success in anything. But if you have a really strong presence, it does significantly improve the odds.
Yeah.
And so I really encourage, and I actually used to be in that business myself, so I can talk offline if people want to understand what the economics look like. But I think both what they're doing is incredibly effective. We're going to work through our own channel. You know, we report to the EU and we have some access that way. So we're all, I know Brazil hired George, so we have a lot of talent that's coalescing. But anything you can do to help keep this going, it's really important.
So
Just maybe to add that,
Yes,
in
Eva.
case, because it was not mentioned, but the one organization that I do work with a lot in Brussels is the US Cotton Trust Protocol, and we're doing a lot of work with them as well to amplify from that side of things.
So in summary, I'd say we have 3 people on the stage today who are really getting stuff done and trying to further the case for cotton and promote the case for cotton. I particularly appreciate Eric bringing the farmer into the room. The millions of farmers a year whose livelihoods depend upon cotton, we're at very low prices today. If cotton continues to lose market share, it's the marginal farmer that will be cut out. And I think we need to make that case very strongly in Brussels as well, because it's quite a strong political case. But above all else, when you look at the cost of the organization that Elisabeth represents, the cost of running it, yes, it's a few €100,000. But shared between the wool industry, the cotton industry, put in the context of a default on a 2,000-ton contract or a weight claim on a shipment, it becomes immediately clear that contributing $5,000, $10,000, $15,000 from your organization would not be a big deal. Even contributing $50,000 put in that context is not a big deal. And I think it really boils down to giving back to the industry that for so many years has been so good to all of us. So I strongly urge people to not just look at the promotion, but look at the financing of actually delivering this. It's happening here and now. It will be done within the year, and that will be the end of that. So now's the time to make sure that Make the Label Count has the resources to make the case really vocally. So I think we've got 5 minutes for questions. A little bit more? Okay, good. I want to leave a little bit of time for questions. First, I want to thank the panelists who, as I say, they're actually getting stuff done. Are there any questions for these panelists before we wrap up today?
Yes, thank you very much. Fritz Green, Vice President, Bremen Cotton Exchange. I would like to, first of all, thank the panel and you, Bill, for the excellent presentation and putting really the topic where it belongs. It's one of the priorities at the moment in our business, for the general cotton business. I have a question to ask. Now, we've heard that the chemical fiber industry is a little bit ahead of us, so they must have done something right. What is it that we can learn from them when it comes to this kind of political level?
Eva, do you want to take that?
Yes, and I think, I mean, the unfortunate answer to that is that they were there early. And they also have, of course, there's a big European industry, and there's a lot of, they are very embedded with their national governments, and that's how I think we got to a council position that looks the way it does now, is that a lot of companies have vested interest in their countries, and they were able to convince their ministers to push the legislation in a certain direction. So there is, I think, it's just very big and it's very embedded in the EU, and they were there early. That is answer number one. But I think with the right data and the right information going to the policymakers now, like I said to you before, it's not too late. It's not a matter of we argued and they weren't convinced. It's a matter of we weren't sufficiently there in the very beginning. We did not, at that point in time, have the network or the contacts. we've built that up. We're in a much better place now. But if you have any contacts or any, if you know people in national governments or generally in the EU bubble, now's the time to talk to them and mobilize them.
Yeah, and we at Make the Label Count, we actually prepare emails, we prepare attachments that you can send, so you're not left alone to write something to a minister in your member country. We actually provide all the resources, so do see us if you have contacts that you can use. And maybe what's also important, and it's quite complex to understand, but we always talk about working inside the tent, which is the development of the PEF methodology itself, and working outside the tent. So what we mainly spoke today is also working outside the tent, of working with legislators who write PEF into legislation, but obviously there's also this very technical work of developing the PEF methodology, and there also again were a lot of fast fashion brands involved, so they were there early.
They started in 2013,
yeah,
the PEF methodology discussion, so it's been going on for a really long time.
Yeah.
But many of those fast fashion brands have been represented in Brussels for years, haven't they?
They've been around for since the dawn of time.
So even more important that we make sure our voices
So we're playing
are heard.
catch up.
Yeah.
George.
My question to both maybe Eva and Elisabeth, you mentioned the 60% turnover of new faces in the Parliament, and there's an educational piece that needs to be done there as well. Thank you. There's an educational piece
Could
that
you
needs
just
to be
start
done.
the question again?
Sorry.
Yeah.
You mentioned 60% turnover in the European Parliament, so there's a heavy lift to re-educate. Obviously, in the Commission, the sort of civil service doesn't change, but there's been shuffling at the top as well. How much of that do you see as opportunity, and how much do you see as actually it's just more work to do?
Well, I mean,
I
it
think
is
both.
basically. I think there is a lot of opportunity. I mean, I think there's opportunity in the sense that the Parliament's position was not the worst of the three positions, and the people who've taken over the rapporteurship have kind of taken over from a fellow party member, so they have been briefed. Also, Delaria Burkhardt was there in the Parliament. She was part of the negotiation, so there is some continuity. But there's also some opportunity because a lot of MEPs are looking for new things to dig their teeth into, and they would like something juicy to profile themselves on, and I think this could be something that we could potentially get them to care about.
Yeah, and I think these new MEPs who need to actually negotiate the position, of course, they're open to receiving information because they now have to educate themselves on the matter. So for now, the people we have been reaching out come back positive. So we see it as an opportunity because the old ones might be, oh yeah, I already know what you were talking about. So
we already know it.
Yeah, so I think it's an opportunity as well. It'll be more work, but we're happy to do that. Yeah.
Is that a question?
That was a question. If I may. My understanding is the product environmental footprint doesn't apply only to apparels and footwear, but is a framework that the EU is developing for a broader range of sustainability issues. And I think what we're getting at, you've raised these issues of carbon sequestration, about microfibers, about land use as a good, social impact, which are not reflected in PEF. But we're asking the EU to change a framework that they're using for a much broader purpose simply than textiles. Is this an achievable goal?
Well, they're not using it yet. I think that's also Elisabeth's point earlier. It's not mandated by any law right now. So making the point that it is not ready and should not be is certainly possible. But there's also the fact that it's used in a lot of other categories. That also means you have a lot of other allies in the agricultural sector. There are a lot of other agricultural groupings that are unhappy about the PEF for very different commodities. They're unhappy about PEF for soy. They're unhappy about PEF for other feed products. So it's really, there are a lot of allies as well, and they are also active. So in that sense, it's good that all the agricultural products share the same concerns about the different iterations of the PEF and how it's being used. And it is not actually used yet as law. So in that sense, it's not too late.
And obviously that work that we've been talking about regarding green claims, that's this like short-term sprint where we're like getting everybody on board. But obviously the work of developing the PEF, and for textiles it's called the Product Environmental Footprint Category Rules for, as you said, apparel and footwear. And obviously those also will go through iterations, and as new methodologies become and new research becomes available, that also needs to be updated. And I think there it's also another area for all of us to work together to actually provide all the data, all the research to it's called the Technical Secretariat, who's developing these category rules for textiles. So it's not over once green claims is done. We still need to work on different areas to improve this methodology. And we'll talk like how to
eco-design.
and yeah, and also like what I said, not just including the environmental harm, but also finding ways to measure the environmental good that our fibers have. So it's not included yet because they say, oh, there's no methodology to do this. So then we need to develop it. So there's a lot of work to be done.
I also need to mention that Cotton Incorporated does sit on the PEF Technical Secretariat, so they can't lobby.
Which is hard to get on.
Yeah.
Yeah, so they hadn't been mentioned just for the sake of completeness. They've been trying to improve the system from within, so.
But they're only one voice.
Yeah, they're only one voice, but I just wanted to mention that.
Just out of interest, who else sits on that secretariat that we might have heard of?
So we have brands like H&M, Inditex Group, which represents Zara, etc. We have IWTO, the wool industry. That a lot of fast fashion brands. But
so there's some vested interest there that we need
and
to balance out.
there's a difference between voting members and non-voting members. So, for example, wool, as of this year, we're no longer a voting member. So that also obviously influences.
Which, if I understand correctly, you have to pay to be able to vote. Which seems...
It's a difficult...
And it's not a small amount of money.
No, exactly. This is the point about the money. The money matters, because without the money, you have no voice. I think there's another question there, Andrew.
Okay, Andrew Hursthouse from In-House Commodity Consulting. I was interested to understand a little bit more about the justification that the Commission gives regarding the point on extraction, that they would not, include that. I'm interested for why, because it seems to be a big...
We've asked that. So the Joint Research Center and also the Commission are of the understanding that oil is just free to use for humankind. It has been created millions and millions of years ago, and it's just there to be used, which is not very logical, but that's for the moment their understanding.
There's a question here, is that are you seeing some of those brands supporting natural fibers as well, or are they biased towards synthetics in your opinion?
Well, I think I have a one-sided view because I come from the wool industry. Obviously, brands who are making wool garments primarily, obviously, they are also totally on board. They also, whenever we have public consultations from the EU, we encourage everyone to take part, so then they do the same. But I don't know, from the cotton industry.
We've been talking to some brands. There are some that are clearly interested, and ICAC will be engaging them more, hopefully with others in the next several months, because there are some who do use a lot of cotton, and they want to use a lot of cotton.
Yeah.
And these, obviously, if the regulation goes the wrong way, it'll really hurt their business.
Yeah.
So we do have brand allies. We're just trying to map those out.
Okay. Do we have time for more questions? There's still hands up.
There's some on the screen.
One more? Vinay?
Yeah, I'm Vinay Kotak. I'm Director of Kotak Group India. Also, I'm an additional Vice President of Cotton Association of India. So I would just propose that ICAC and ICA, together with Cotton Association of India, can have some kind of a task to collect some funds from India. There are big groups who are having interest only in cotton mainly. So we can, as a Cotton Association, can help you, and we can work together for the purpose. That's one. And second, my suggestion, I'm taking liberty of suggestion, to put a pressure on politician media is the power. Why can't we go into more in the media like newspapers, TV interviews and all that? Automatically there will be under pressure. That's my suggestion.
Thank you, Vinay. So on the first one, I think we just take note that the Cotton Association of India wants to engage on this, so that's great. I'd just say on the second one, I mean, certainly I've seen some of the media that Woolmark has released, the campaign you had where wool not fossil fueled, the campaign where wool not waste, which were incredibly creative. Perhaps touch on that, but is that something?
Yeah, I mean, that's always important to communicate, and it's also a matter of money. So in the past, from the campaign, we've had invested more in paid media, also promoting like social posts on LinkedIn to really target certain audiences, because funding we had to save at some point, so we have reduced that. But obviously, if we had more funding to invest also in these types of amplifications through communications, yeah, we could, of course, reach more and have a bigger impact.
It comes down to the money again. Okay, I think we're out of time, so thank you all very much. I think the message is clear, and hopefully, as a Cotton family, we can deliver.